Hello and welcome to the MovieMuse podcast, episode 9, Animation Antics. This month, the MovieMuse team are getting our teeth into the crazy world of the animated movie. From the early days of hand-drawn cartoons to the latest CGI blockbusters. Of course, we'll have all our usual insightful segments, such as what we've been watching, looking at films that we are looking forward to, a very interesting film club choice, all mixed with the usual incisive, witty banter you've come to expect from the boys from the Muse. Here in the MovieMuse Playhouse, all looking very animated, I have to say. We have Gordon, Mickey Mouse Sinclair.
Hello, Pluto.
Matt, Donald Duck Corn. Graham, Goofy Mason. And I am Simon, Pluto Burton, and I'm your erstwhile host for this nostalgic trip down Animation Avenue.
Can I just ask, what does erstwhile mean? Because you said that last time. I don't know what erstwhile means.
You're sort of honoured host for this evening or something like that.
Shall we look it up? Erstwhile seems to be one time, so like former.
Oh, was it?
So you're a former host. Yeah, according to this. Former one time, or adverb, archaic, long ago, or formerly.
Well, it is archaic, to be fair.
Yeah, we'll leave it in.
I didn't know that. I thought it was like esteemed.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I think that's what you should be using, is esteemed, not erstwhile.
Oh, okay.
But never mind.
First up, we have the latest news from the MovieMuse website, moviemuse.net. This month, we have a review of the latest American superhero film based on the DC Comics anti-hero team of the same name, Suicide Squad, which is the third installment of the DC Extended Universe. We also have a very interesting article from Matt, which is From Screen to Toy Box, a brief history of sci-fi toys. Matt takes a look back at some classic sci-fi movies and TV shows and the licensed toys that help kids across the world recreate their heroes' on-screen adventures in the comfort of their own bedroom. We also have a Pixar box set review, which is the first 10 years, from Toy Story right through to The Incredibles. We also have the Adrian Mole box set review from Gordon, which is of the TV series of the iconic books by Sue Townsend, about the adolescent Adrian Mole and the trials and tribulations of his stumbling through the growing up in the 80s West Midlands. So guys, what have we all been watching? Gordon, what's been floating your boat this month?
I watched The Neon Demon. I'm a massive fan of Nicholas Winding Refn, who's famous for the Drive movie. But after seeing him being interviewed about The Neon Demon, I was really concerned that success had gone to his head and that this film was going to be a self-indulgent mess. However, I was pleasantly surprised that despite having a lesbian necrophilia scene and someone coughing up an eyeball, it was actually quite restrained. And it's possibly my third favourite of his films after Drive and Pusher, and I would give it 3.5 stars. And the second film that I watched is one that I suggested a while back as a film that I was looking forward to, War Dogs, which is a tale about two young lads who win a huge military contract with the US government. It's very much the story of Miles Teller's character in the film. So Jonah Hill, who plays the other guy, comes off pretty badly. And despite being directed by the guy who did The Hangover, it isn't an all-out comedy. It has enough humour to keep the pace without spoiling the fact that it is based on a true story. But I'd love to see a more serious and detailed telling of what really happened, because this feels like they've skipped a hell of a lot to try and keep the movie going. But I still really enjoyed it, and I'd give War Dogs 3 stars.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Matt?
I haven't watched a lot of movies, so one of the things I'm going to talk about is a TV show, and it's a TV show that lots of people have been talking about over the last month or so, Stranger Things, which, while it is a TV show, is heavily influenced by 80s movies and pop culture. The story's set in a small town in the early 80s where a young boy goes missing on his way home one night, seemingly abducted by a mysterious creature that lives in the shadows. And at the same time, a strange young girl appears in the town having escaped from a nearby laboratory, and she's taken in by the missing boy's friends. The show perfectly captures the aesthetics of the 80s and certainly owes a lot to films such as E.T. and The Goonies, as well as TV shows like Twilight Zone and the writings of Stephen King. The story also reminded me of the movie Watchers, which was a late 80s adaptation of a Dean Koontz novel starring Corey Haim. The acting from the young leads is great, and you really warm to them and want to find out what happens and whether they find their friend. It's got Winona Ryder in it. She's a bit flaky as the missing boy's mum, but somehow that actually works quite well in the context of the story. The local sheriff, played by David Harbour, is also a great character. One thing I noticed about it, about 3 episodes from the end, there's a massive inconsistency in the plot, and the more I thought about it, I think this is actually intentional, because it just sort of adds to the 80s style. These kind of issues were prevalent in 80s TV shows where the plot didn't quite meld together. So pretty much everything you've heard about people raving about this programme is true. It's a thrilling story and a love letter to 80s pop culture. A second season is already in production for 2017 and I can't wait for that. It's perfect binge watching fodder with 8 episodes, I think, and it gets a hearty 5 stars from me. The other film I've watched recently is Vacation, which is the 2015 sequel/remake of the 1983 classic National Lampoon's Vacation, which I also watched again recently as it happens. And it stars Ed Helms as Rusty Griswold, son of Chevy Chase's character in the original films. He now has his own family and decides to take them on the same road trip from Chicago to California to visit the Wally World amusement park, and as expected, many disasters befall them along the way, some of which are more amusing than others. It does have some funny moments and nods to the original film, but relies a bit more on the modern gross-out sight gags than the subtle or dumb innocent comedy of the original. It's got Chris Hemsworth in it. He's particularly embarrassing in a supporting role that he surely never needed to take in the first place, given how much money he must make from being Thor. And it's got Chevy Chase and Beverly D'Angelo making brief cameos towards the end of the movie, but neither has really aged well or adds anything meaningful to the story. It's nowhere near as good as the original, but it's still fairly entertaining, and at least Wally World was actually open when they got there this time, so I'm going to give that 2.5 stars.
Okay, Graham, what have you been watching this month?
This month I've watched 3 films of note. Suicide Squad, I already wrote a review for the website, as you mentioned, Simon. And the other 2 films of note I have watched, the first is Predator 2, which Gordon won't consider of note, of course, as he's not a fan of this one. It stars Danny Glover in the lead role instead of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Got a lot of stick at the time. I think it's generally appreciated a little bit more now. Admittedly, it's still not a great film, but I enjoy it. It's got a lot of flashes of entertainment in it throughout the whole film. The acting is fairly terrible throughout, to be honest, but it's kind of becoming a cult classic now, so I enjoyed that a lot. And I would give Predator 2 3 stars out of 5. And the other film I watched, somewhat better in quality, was 10 Cloverfield Lane, which isn't a sequel to the 2008 film Cloverfield. I believe it's just a kind of spiritual follow-up in some form. This is the story of a young girl who has a car accident and finds herself imprisoned in a cellar. The film was originally called The Cellar as well. Her captor is played by John Goodman, who's basically one of these guys who is absolutely obsessed by preparing for the end of the world. And she's imprisoned with one other guy in this cellar. And it's a really good setup, the film. The acting is very good, and there's a lot of tension as they obviously try and work out how to escape, and they realise what their captors really like. I must say the payoff and the ending is a little bit predictable and not quite what I was expecting or what I thought the film would do, but it is very enjoyable and very well acted, and I will give it 4 out of 5.
I'd agree with you wholeheartedly. It's definitely a 4-star film. It's really good, some really good performances. John Goodman in particular is excellent. But the one thing I didn't like about it was the shoehorning of Cloverfield in, and that almost ruined the film for me. It was a great, tense thriller in its own right, and they didn't need at the last minute to turn it into a Cloverfield film.
Yeah.
Do you know why they did that?
No, all I know is that originally the script was called The Cellar. This script had been going around for ages, and it was optioned by Bad Robot, and at some point the name got changed into 10 Cloverfield Lane, and when I saw the trailer at the cinema for it, I was just captivated by the trailer. I thought it looked brilliant, but I just assumed it had something to do with Cloverfield, so I didn't actually know that it had nothing to do with Cloverfield, so I was expecting the monster to turn up in the end.
I think it was probably, like most things in America, some focus group didn't really like it and wanted something attached to it, some bigger story. So I assume it's to appease the money men.
Thanks very much, Graham. So what I was watching in the last month is just, I've been away on holiday and I've just been, apart from the Olympics, I brought my Laurel and Hardy box set with me, and I've just been watching Laurel and Hardy most of the time. Obviously I'm not going to review films and go on throughout what's on there, so I haven't got anything to rate or review. Right, every month we have what we call the Wag's Choice, where one of our better halves gives us something to look at which may not be in our comfort zone. This month, as my better half Jackie chose, the 1994 thriller Leon the Professional. It's written and directed by Luc Besson, and it stars Jean Reno and Gary Oldman and features the motion picture debut of Natalie Portman. In the film, Reno is a professional hitman who reluctantly takes on the 12-year-old Matilda, played by Portman, after her family are murdered by corrupt Drug Enforcement Administration agent Norman Stansfield, played by Oldman. Leon and Matilda form an unusual relationship as she becomes his protege and learns the hitman's trade. So what do we think of Leon? What do you think, Graham?
Is it Leon or Leon?
Leon. I'm going by Leon.
Leon Professional. I mean, this is not really out of my comfort zone. It's a film that I like very much. I've seen it a couple of times in the 90s. I haven't watched it since then, I must admit. It's an excellent crime thriller. I wouldn't say it's a favourite film of mine, but it's very enjoyable. The best part for me, I'm a big fan of him, is Gary Oldman's performance as Stansfield, the corrupt agent in it. I think he's brilliant and he really makes the film. And there are excellent performances as well from Jean Reno and Natalie Portman, is it? It's an excellent film. I really like it. But as I say, I've seen it a couple of times already, and so it's my sort of film. So I would definitely give Leon 4 out of 5.
Matt, what did you think of Leon?
Like Graham, I've seen it before, but I haven't seen it for a long time, so I did watch it again. It was good to revisit what is a very good film. Despite the action, the main core to the story is the relationship between Leon and Matilda, and both actors are exceptional in their roles as their characters grow to appreciate one another in an unusual, to say the least, situation. Contrary to what Graham said, I found Gary Oldman a bit ludicrous in his role as the antagonist, but I guess that's kind of the point to a certain extent as well. The end showdown is a bit lacking, I think, compared to the rest of the film. It kind of goes out a little bit of a damp squib for me, but overall it's a great film with a nice mix of action, drama and some comedic moments as well, and I'd give it 3.5 stars.
Gordon?
I can't really add much to what the other guys have said other than I think it is called Leon, but I also, like Simon, call it Leon. And it's a really good film. It's exactly the kind of film that I like. It's got fantastic performances. As Matt said, it's mainly about that relationship between those two, and I think that relationship is what makes it. And if Portman and Reno had not had good on-screen chemistry, then the film would have been a disaster. So it was as much a triumph for the casting as it was for the director, I think. And yeah, great film, 4 stars.
Yeah, I agree with everyone's. I've got to say, I like Gary Oldman's character. I did think he was a little crazy and over the top, but as Matt said as well, I think that was the point. But I've got to say, by the end of it, I just wanted Leon to get him. I just wanted him taken out. I was on the edge of my seat. I'd never seen it before. So I was like, by the end of it, I was literally urging myself, saying, "Someone just get him." But it was excellent. I thought all the performances were great in it, and it was tense in places, and the relationship was pretty unique, and it just wrapped you in the story, and I thought it was excellent. I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 as well. Well, thanks very much, guys. Leon seems a popular choice, and the total added up together gives it a total of 3.9 out of 5. Next month's Wag's Choice is going to be from Gordon's other half, Nancy. So what have we got to look forward to, Gordon?
Well, Nancy's a big fan of both classic cinema and crime dramas, so she was always going to pick something black and white and suspenseful. And what she's picked for us is the 1947 gangster film noir, Brighton Rock. It was directed by John Bolton and stars a young Richard Attenborough as Pinky Brown, a vicious young thug who takes control of a ruthless gang after its leader is killed. Pinky plots revenge on a newspaper reporter that he blames for causing the death by writing an article about the rackets that the gang were involved in. The film was adapted from the 1938 novel by Graham Greene and was previously performed to great acclaim at the West End, also starring Attenborough as Pinky. It was a big hit in the UK, where the violence was seen as quite groundbreaking for the time. It was later released in the US under the title Young Scarface, but was much less successful there, where violence in film was far more commonplace. I've seen the film a number of times now, and there's also a 2010 remake that moved the film from its 40s setting to the 1960s mods versus rockers era. But I'll certainly look forward to rewatching it and giving my thoughts next time.
Okay, next up is our section called Coming Soon. This is where the MovieMuse team give an insight into movies that are coming up in the latter half of 2016, maybe a bit of early 2017, and what ones we're looking forward to. Matt, what have you spotted on the movie horizon?
Well, to be honest, there's not a lot coming out over the next couple of months that's piqued my interest at all. So again, much like talking about Stranger Things, I'm going for a TV show. It's a new TV show coming out at the beginning of October based on a movie, which is Westworld, the well-known 70s sci-fi thriller. I haven't actually seen the movie and I need to rectify that before I watch the TV show, but the TV show certainly looks like it could be really good. Seems to loosely follow the story of the film, with a rogue android causing chaos in a Wild West theme park, but I assume it will elaborate on that story quite a lot and focus on artificial intelligence and virtual reality, both of which are developing at a fast pace in the modern world. The series has been co-created by Jonathan Nolan, who's brother of Christopher and co-writer of The Dark Knight and other great films directed by his brother. It's also executive produced by J.J. Abrams, which is usually a sign of quality. It's got a top-notch cast, including Anthony Hopkins as the creator of the park and Ed Harris taking on Yul Brynner's role as the android gunslinger, which I think is really good casting. So it should be great. It starts in early October, as I mentioned, on HBO in America and Sky Atlantic in the UK.
I watched Westworld not that long ago, and I had seen it a long time ago. The film hasn't aged brilliantly, but it's still a very good watch, so you should definitely watch it before it comes on. But I think updating that now with the advances in technology is an absolutely inspired choice.
Graham, anything that's on the horizon?
Well, like Matt, Not really very much, actually, but I did notice one film. I think it's released in cinemas on the 5th of October in the UK, and it's a film called The Girl on the Train. Haven't found out too much about it because, as usual, I don't really want to know too much about it before I watch it. But it sounds an intriguing setup. It's about a woman played by Emily Blunt, who has just gone through a divorce, and on her travels to work every day on a train, she travels past a family who she kind of starts to associate with a bit every day, and then eventually she witnesses something. The young girl in the family disappears. It sounds like a kind of Agatha Christie type mystery almost, but I believe it might have a little bit more behind it than that, and a simple whodunit. And it just sounds an intriguing setup. It could well be complete hogwash and a total potboiler, but it's the sort of film that I like to go in with not knowing anything about and find I can invest myself in, and I hope that it doesn't disappoint. It's not directed by anyone I know, and I think apart from Lisa Kudrow, who of course used to be Phoebe in Friends, it doesn't really star anyone else I know, so the cast isn't particularly stellar, but that of course doesn't mean it can't be a great film. So I'm looking forward to seeing that when it comes out next month.
Thanks very much, Graham. My choice is completely against the way I feel about these films, and because we're doing the animation podcast now, I've gone for one that I know is just going to annoy me, and I just think it's going to be just a typical animated film that you get from the main studios that do it. It's that new Trolls film. It's a 33rd DreamWorks animated film, and I know all it's going to be is another film with cutesy type characters, and they all save the day, and they all live happily ever after, and they're going to sell millions and millions of merchandise around the world for it. But I'm going to watch it. I've got into animated films from this podcast. It's got a pretty good voice cast, like Anna Kendrick, Justin Timberlake's in it, Zooey Deschanel, Russell Brand and James Corden and Gwen Stefani. So it just revolves around the usual story of two trolls on a quest, save their village from destruction by these other people called the Bergens. It'll all probably be, they'll go through some hardship, things will go bad, they'll fall out with people, they'll be probably banished from the village, they'll come back, save the day. It's going to be the standard format, but I'm just going to force myself to watch this just to see how it goes. It's scheduled to be released on November the 4th, so hopefully it might be something to watch in the dark nights. Finally, we go to Gordon, who is doing a trailer choice.
I've picked War on Everyone. It's a thriller comedy about two corrupt cops in New Mexico who set out to blackmail and frame every criminal unfortunate enough to cross their paths. Things take a sinister turn, however, when they intimidate someone who's far more dangerous than they are. The film's in cinemas from the 7th of October, so let's have a look at the trailer and see what you think.
Let's go fuck some scumbags.
I love this song.
Great song.
I always wondered if you hit a mime, does he make a sound?
Well, now you know.
Welcome back, boys. How did we enjoy our sabbatical?
It was very relaxing. I masturbated a lot.
I received very serious allegations of assault. Corruption charges against you.
Are you trying to bribe us, man?
No.
Now, what have we learned?
Bribery and corruption, bad.
Yes, progress has been made.
Number is
Son of a fucking robber. Any questions, gentlemen?
What happened to the driver?
He got away with the money. Close to $1 million.
$1 million.
$1 million.
$1 million.
Whose money?
Our money.
The whole thing was planned by this British dude named James Mangan.
Where can we find him?
What am I, Huggy Bear now?
Hoogie Bear.
Hey, Shorty, where can we find James Mangan?
I don't know. I swear to God. Give me back my wig.
Put the wig on, put the wig on.
Sorry, man. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you like that. Destroy.
No plot in these things anymore.
You ain't got a good script. You ain't got shit.
Right, that looks interesting. So what do you think, Graham?
I thought this film looked pretty cool, actually. When I first started watching it, I thought it was set in the 70s or something with the colour palette in it.
Yeah.
I assume it's not, but it did look kind of retro funk. It looked like a sort of hipster update of Starsky and Hutch, and I think there's even a reference to Huggy Bear in the trailer as well. It looks like it's acerbic, violent, lots of swearing. Yeah, could be good fun, really. So I'm looking forward to this as well. So good choice, Gordon.
Matt, what were your thoughts?
Well, when I first started watching the trailer, I wondered why Gordon had picked what looked like a generic cop comedy movie, and then I saw that it was written and directed by the man responsible for The Guard, and my interest was suddenly piqued by that. I don't know if anyone's seen The Guard, but that is a really good film. It's a short trailer, but it looks like the film has plenty of action and comedy, and knowing how good The Guard was, I'm certainly interested to see it. It seems to have got decent reviews from the limited release it's had so far. It's been already released at a couple of festivals, I think, around the world, so I'll definitely be interested to check it out. But yeah, I would recommend, if you haven't seen The Guard, that you watch that, and that will make you want to watch this film more.
Thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, I agree with what's been said so far. Looks interesting with the two cops together. Nice little bit of interaction with them. I like the fact that the captain's telling them off and they're like, what have you learnt from this? And they're like, and other bits and pieces look really good. Definitely one to look out for, and I'm quite interested in that one.
I'm not sure the names of the two leads, but one of them that's a Hispanic, I think he is.
Yeah.
He was in Ant-Man, and I thought he was really funny in Ant-Man as one of the supporting characters.
Michael Pena.
Michael
is his
Pena,
name.
that's it. I've not seen him in a lead role before, so I think that'll be really interesting to see him step up into a lead role. I think he's been a brilliant supporting actor in most of the films that I've seen.
It's got Paul Reiser in as well as a police chief from Beverly Hills Cop and Aliens.
Awesome.
Thanks very much, everyone, for that, and thanks, Gordon, for your trailer choice. Now we move on to the main feature, the big wide world of the animated movie. Pretty much everyone loves cartoons, whether it be a comic strip in a newspaper or a magazine to TV shows and, of course, films. There is something magical about animation as a media, and you can feel the love and care and attention to detail that has been lavished on the movie, on something that has been created as opposed to film with live action. Animated films have their roots way back in the early 20th century. The first animated film created using what came to be known as traditional hand-drawn animation was the 1908 Phantasmagoria by Emil Cole. During the 1910s, the production of animated short films, typically referred to as cartoons, became the industry of its own, and cartoon shorts were produced for showing in movie theatres. In the 1920s, Otto Messer of Pat Sullivan Studios created Felix the Cat. It was distributed by Paramount Studios and it attracted a large audience. Felix was the first cartoon to be merchandised and he soon became a household name. But in 1923, a studio called Laugh-O-Grams went bankrupt and its owner, Walt Disney, opened a new studio in Los Angeles which gave birth to the Walt Disney Company. Disney's first notable breakthrough was 1928 Steamboat Willie, the third of the Mickey Mouse series. Many consider Walt Disney's 1937 film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs the first animated feature film, though at least 7 films were released earlier. However, Disney's film was the first one completely made using hand-drawn animation. Colour television was introduced to the US market in 1951, and by 1958 the studio of Hanna-Barbera released Huckleberry Hound, the first half-hour television programme to feature only animation, and in 1960 they released the seminal Flintstones, securing cartoons on TV as a popular part of our culture to this day. As technology improved, it was inevitable that animation techniques would change with the times, and after a succession of still hand-drawn feature films throughout the 80s, the first fully computer-animated feature film was released in 1995 by the new Pixar studio, Toy Story. Pixar grew from strength to strength and were joined by DreamWorks, among others, in producing a myriad of CGI animated movies, which are still going strong to this day. With a strong presence on TV and in the cinemas, animated films are well and truly here to stay. And now, the MovieMuse team will take you on a journey through the extraordinary world of the animated movie. To start this off, we are going to look at hand-drawn animation as a media technique, as this is where the films started from their infancy. So what I'm going to start with is a question on a film that Disney produced in 1940 called Fantasia. Now what we need to decide is whether we think it's a masterpiece or is it an overindulgent mess, and is its impact on the genre as a whole? Is it a classic, or do you think it went on too long and it was just them practicing their animation techniques and just put it all together to classical music? Gordon, what did you make of it?
Well, like with many of these concept films, I think it's a technical marvel that deserves its place in history. But is it something that I'd sit down and watch through in its entirety? Probably not. I haven't watched it that recently, but I do remember it being very dark and quite scary in places, like most of the early Disney films. I think when most people think about Fantasia, all they see in their head is the Sorcerer's Apprentice segment, and to be honest, that's the only bit that I would really seek out again. So whilst I think it is a technical marvel, it's not something I'd choose to watch.
Thanks, G. Graham, have you watched it at all, and what did you think?
Yeah, I've seen Fantasia. I think I totally agree with what Gordon says, but I can imagine at the time it was quite a stunning piece of work. I mean, the music in it is quite evocative, and I remember watching several Disney compilations on TV back in the 80s when I was a kid and watching that Sorcerer's Apprentice segment and thinking how brilliant that was. The rest of the film never really came up to that, in my opinion, in terms of emotion and the action in it. But as I say, back in the 1940s, I can imagine audiences were pretty much stunned, although obviously in terms of its technology it has dated quite a lot. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing with CGI, well, that's something we might talk about later. It is fairly plotless and quite nonsensical in places, so it's not really something I'd want to sit down and watch. And I've tried to watch it with my children as well, and they just wouldn't sit still long enough to watch it beyond probably the opening segment. So it's a bit of a strange beast, but like Gordon says, it's iconic and it has its place in not just animated cinema, but cinema in general, I think.
Matt, what are your thoughts on Fantasia?
Much the same, really. I've only seen it once, and that was a long time ago, but I do remember at the time thinking it was a great technical achievement for the era it was made, but aside from The Sorcerer's Apprentice, it's not really a lot of fun to watch, and it's not very memorable, really. In terms of its impact, I think it must have pushed the art of animation forward a lot in that era, and certainly influenced a great many people to get into animation, so I think, in retrospect, it's certainly influential, but in terms of it being a good film, not particularly.
Well, as I've only watched it a couple of days ago, and it's fresh in my mind, I did actually quite enjoy watching it all the way through. I actually concentrated on it and just let the music wash over me, and I just lost myself in it. And I know it's old, and I was still amazed at what they achieved at that time with the animation in it and how they put it all together. And obviously, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, as you say, is the thing everyone remembers, and I still quite enjoyed that, but maybe not as much as some of the other bits. I like the going back in prehistoric times with the dinosaurs and stuff. I quite like that bit. And yeah, as a whole, I thought it was really good. For how long ago it was made, it still has an impact and it's still quite watchable, but you have to sort of let yourself get lost in it. Moving on from that, what other animated movies do you see that are classic or influential? Obviously, there's quite a lot of Disney films throughout the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s that you wouldn't think of and think, oh yeah, I remember that, Lady and the Tramp and Robin Hood, all these films. I mean, there's any particular ones that stand out to you guys that you can look back and think, yeah, that was an iconic moment? Matt, any particular films that you would look back on fondly from those periods?
Generally not. I'm actually not a big fan of that era of animation. I think Disney pretty much ruled the world of animated filmmaking till the 60s when other companies began to produce feature-length animated films. There are a few notable examples. I don't necessarily like them all, but there's a producer, two people called Rankin and Bass, that produced films from the 60s onwards, did a lot of films for TV based on seasonal holidays like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman, very popular in America, I believe. But they also produced several animated films based on books, and the one that's notable for me is The Hobbit, which was produced in 1977, which was the first adaptation of a Tolkien book, and is actually pretty good. Packs most of the story into its 77 minutes running time. Peter Jackson, take note. Don't need 3 2.5-hour films to do The Hobbit. That film was actually animated by a Japanese company called Topcraft, and members of that company went on to form Studio Ghibli, so if you're a fan of their stuff, it might be worth watching. They also produced, Rankin and Bass, an adaptation of Return of the King, which was rubbish, and eventually went on to produce Thundercats. There's a couple of other notable animators from the 70s and 80s that I think did some quite influential films. There's Ralph Bakshi, who did the ill-fated Lord of the Rings animated film in 1978. Also did a lot more adult-themed animated films such as Fritz the Cat and Fire and Ice. And Don Bluth, who originally worked for Disney, formed his own studio in the 80s and released successful feature films like The Secret of Nim, An American Tale and The Land Before Time, and was actually most famous to us probably for providing the animation for Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, the video games. So I think while Disney were the masters of it all, there were some influential companies that did some decent stuff, but not really till the 70s and 80s.
Thanks, Matt. Graham, what do you consider iconic for those times?
I've had a long look back over the last week or so about the movies that were released in this period, and like Matt says, it's mainly Disney, certainly in the 40s, 50s and 60s. A lot of the films that Matt mentioned from other studios I've never seen. I tried to catch up with a couple of them, but they don't really appeal to me, to be honest. Obviously, we were all born in the 70s after all these movies had come out, and I think growing up, I just never really watched animated movies. I watched a lot of animated TV, so as a result, I've got no nostalgia for a lot of these films. I've tried watching a lot of Disney movies retrospectively, like Sleeping Beauty, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Dumbo, but I just find that by today's standards they tend to drag an awful lot and the pacing is very slow. But there is one that stands out for me, and that's The Jungle Book, and this is mainly because when I was younger I used to have the soundtrack to this on record, and it was, you know what it's like when you're young, you play the same record over and over again, or I did at least, and The Jungle Book was the record that I drove my parents mad with, and I really loved it. And then when I finally got round to seeing the film a year or so later, I loved that as well because it had all my favourite songs in it. And I think it's a lot more modern than a lot of the other Disney films that I mentioned. For obvious reasons, it is a bit newer as well. So I would say probably that's my favourite of the era.
I've got to say, Graham, I had that record. And is it the one where you had the book and it used to ring the bell and you turn the page over? Oh, I used to love that.
Yeah, I have to agree 100% with what you said there, Graham. The Jungle Book is the only Disney film from that era, or any era really, the 2D animation that I actually like. I think all those other films like Snow White and all the Disney princesses and cute anthropomorphic little fuzzy animals, they just basically make me sick and I just don't want to watch them.
Thanks, Graham. And Matt. Gordon, what's your take on all this?
Well, there's not really anything to say about the fact that movie-wise, that it was probably just Disney. But I'd probably say that apart from Disney's output, you could look to people like Tex Avery as masters of the art form. Virtually all of the characters that he created were short features, so they were shown in cinemas, but they weren't necessarily feature-length movies as we would see them. But he's most famous for creating the likes of Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and other Looney Tunes. But the other thing that's really important about Tex Avery is that he did the first ever live-action animated movie. He did a whodunit spoof called Who Killed Who in 1943, which was the first film to use live-action and animation combined.
That's interesting. I didn't realise it went back as far as that. I totally agree with what everyone said. I mean, Disney was the main output in all this time, and then you can reel off the amount of films that they did, and people will remember them, maybe remember the name more than they remember the film. You know, it was of the era, the films were more of the children, they were not really adult-oriented at any time, but people can enjoy them. It was family films, and Disney were just churning them out one after the other, but there wasn't really any challenge to them in those days. And eventually it started to get a bit more excitement towards the 80s, and there was a little bit more difference in the animated films. I didn't mind it as an era, but again, like you, I don't think I'll go back and watch a lot of that now. But Graham, I did love The Jungle Book. Once you had that record, there was no going back, I think. But, you know, just bringing that around again. Guys, do you really think there is still a place for 2D animation as a major feature film? Matt, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there is still a place for it, for sure. It still seems to be going strong, particularly in Japan, and I think it will become probably the domain of smaller independent productions rather than the huge studios. So we could see more creative and less predictable stories using 2D animation compared to the identikit 3D CGI movies that we're getting for the majority of big budget productions at the moment.
Graham, you got anything to add?
Matt kind of hit the nail on the head there. Smaller, more independent productions maybe can succeed. But let's face it, they're not going to succeed on a wider audience, because I just think kids today wouldn't be drawn towards, maybe they'd enjoy it if they saw it, but they wouldn't go to the cinema to see it or buy the DVD. So I think probably as a market, it's particularly limited today, although a lot of that animation does have a lot of appeal, in my opinion, and there's a good craft behind it, and it takes a lot of skill. But I think any major studio will think that the main audience has got to be children. It's going to be something that's going to hang around, especially in Japan and in independent studios. But I don't think really it can do much more than that these days, unfortunately.
Gordon?
I think, as has been said, commercially only niche. But commercial isn't the only consideration. And I think if the question is there still a place for 2D animation, then the answer is 100% yes. I think if you look to Studio Ghibli for some of their fantastic examples of 2D and classic-styled animated movies, and the studio took an indefinite hiatus in 2014, so I think that was a massive loss to this area of animation. But their 20 feature films that they've produced, they've had 5 nominations for Best Animated Feature, and they've had 1 winner with 2002 Spirited Away. So I think there's absolutely a place for good quality storytelling in the 2D animated form, and I think that's the problem, is that these now have to be better stories than most of the CG animated stuff that is akin to, you know, a drama versus an action film. You need to make it more serious, more adult oriented, but that just feeds into everything that I like. So 2D animation gets a 2 thumbs up from me.
Thanks very much. Well, after that, we're going to pick our favourite drawn animated film. Matt, what's your favourite?
Well, I was never a fan of Disney, as I've mentioned, even as a kid, so I'm going to go for the only traditional animated film I own on DVD, which is Transformers the movie. It expanded the story from the cartoon series well into a full-blown space opera, featured the emotional death of some of the favourite characters from the TV show, and featured an excellent score by Vince DiCola, who also did the Rocky IV training montages, not to mention some cheesy 80s rock on the soundtrack, and voice acting from such luminaries as Leonard Nimoy and Eric Idle. It's also still the best Transformers movie, despite 4 attempts to better it by Michael Bay.
Graham.
Mine's the 1994 movie Lion King, which I think was one of the final, if not the final, hand-drawn movie by Disney. I think it might have had computer graphic enhancements in some places as well. This was a great movie, I thought, one of the best Disney movies. I've also been to see the show in London, the stage show based on it, and I love that as well. I wouldn't say it's one of my favourite movies, but I'm not a big fan of Disney in general, but I do regard it as one of their better movies and a classic in its own right.
Thanks, Graham. Gordon?
I'm picking Grave of the Fireflies. It's a 1988 Studio Ghibli film based on a semi-autobiographical book telling the story of 2 young siblings and their desperate struggle to survive during the final months of the Second World War when their parents are killed in a firebombing attack. And apart from it being my favourite 2D animated movie, I'd put it in my top 3 war movies and in my top 10 movies of any type.
My choice is the 1978 British animated adventure thriller Watership Down, based on the novel of the same name by Richard Adams. And it follows a group of rabbits and their struggle for existence in leafy Berkshire, and had the Simon & Garfunkel record Bright Eyes as part of the soundtrack, which is quite an iconic track itself. And it was also the first animated feature film to present in Dolby surround sound. I always like the books, I like the film. It's always been something I've watched and quite enjoyed.
And it also caused a huge fuss on the last bank holiday when Channel 4 showed it during the day and not in the evening, and lots of parents sat their kids down to watch it and traumatised them.
All right.
Well, they should know better. Everyone knows that film's traumatising.
Well, I think only people of our age, you know. A lot of parents these days are only in the 20s themselves.
I suppose, yeah. They should be more educated.
They should, quite right.
Get yourself on IMDb before you show your kids anything, I'd say.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Moving on, we're now entering the crazy and massive world of the CGI animated movie. This all started with Toy Story, released by Pixar. It was directed by John Lasseter in his directorial debut, and it was also the first theatrical film produced by Pixar, so it was where it all started, I suppose. It was released in cinemas on November 22nd, 1995, and this is obviously the start of where the CGI juggernaut in animated movies came from. Obviously, it put Pixar as a name out there in the animated world as well, which led to Disney buying it in 2006. So what are your thoughts on Toy Story? Is it still holds up well today, and is it as iconic as we think? Gordon, what do you think?
Yes, of course, it's iconic and it's really important, and when it came out it was absolutely groundbreaking, and it still holds up as one of the best CG animated films, mainly because it was a great story with great characters. But one thing that really bothers me about Toy Story is I believe all of these toys moving about and coming to life and all of that, and I have no problem believing in that. But the CG animated people really bothered me because they were so unrealistic. CG at that time wasn't good enough to make the people, or maybe they wanted more of a cartoon aesthetic, but it kind of jarred it because you had these toys that looked like real toys coming to life, and then you had these people that looked like cartoon characters. And I think that almost ruined the film for me, and I think if they'd have gone away from this gimmick of it being the first ever fully computer animated film and stuck some live action real people in for those roles, it would have made the film a lot better for me, because it lost some of its realism, which might be a stupid thing to say about an animated film about toys coming to life.
Quite a good view, actually, Gordon. I was watching some of them today, and I even think some of the later ones, it's a very similar thing. The humans just don't seem right for what they're trying to portray in the film, and there is something that grates a little bit, I think, especially in those early days. Graham, what was your thoughts on Toy Story?
Pretty much echo what Gordon says, really. It is an iconic film, there's no doubt about that. I think it's difficult to remember, seeing as it was over 20 years ago, the impact it had when it came out. But I remember I was 20-something years old then, and didn't matter whether you were 20-something, 30-something, 40-something, younger or whatever, you went and saw Toy Story. That's what everyone did. It still bears up a lot today, the computer graphics. What I don't like so much about it is a familiar bugbear, and something that's carried on to this day is how it's quite twee and there's a moral message in it. But I think generally it can still be considered a classic. It's got some great sequences in it. The one that always strikes me is when Buzz Lightyear first realises that he's actually a toy, And I think that, like I mentioned earlier about Fantasia, it's not just an animated classic. I think it is a classic movie in its own right. It's one of the best movies of all time and has a right to be regarded as that, even if perhaps its shine has slightly been dulled by the mass of similar movies we have today.
Thanks, Graham. Matt, what do you think?
Well, I'm a little bit different with Toy Story in so much as I never actually went to see it at the cinema. I saw it when it came out on DVD and I was impressed by the animation and the story was great, but I don't think I ever really loved the characters in it like a lot of people do until I watched Toy Story 3 and the scene where they're all about to be destroyed. It was like a proper tear-jerking scene, which was obviously intentional by Pixar, but it wasn't till then that I realised the magic that they'd done of creating characters that you really cared for, and they're just these stupid computer-generated characters. So I didn't really feel the impact until I watched that scene in Toy Story 3. I'm like, holy shit, I really care about these characters and I'm worried about them dying. Everything the other guys have said is spot on. It's influential, it's iconic, but I don't think I really realised how influential until seeing the possible fate of those characters.
Thanks, Matt. I didn't go to see the cinema either. I was a DVD watcher as well. But it was everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. But as the first CGI film, I thought it was really good. I think the story was good. I mean, I love Buzz Lightyear when he still thinks he's really is part of Star Command and the way he's doing all that bit. And then in the later films when he meets other Buzz Lightyears and he thinks, was I ever that stupid? I love stuff like that. I like the aliens and the grabbing machine. It's like all the little touches like that. And I think, yeah, it was good. You know, I totally agree with everyone said, and it is iconic. And I actually still enjoy it now. And it does really still hold up.
The claw.
Ooh.
The claw.
I have been chosen.
That is brilliant. Okay, well, obviously, Toy Story is the first CGI animated movie. Pixar, obviously, studio responsible for that. They've gone on from strength to strength on the back of what they produced there, to a point where Disney thought they were that good that they bought them out. Do you think, as a studio, is Pixar untouchable in this market? Or do you think other studios will come to the fore? And have you got any particular favourites among them? Graham?
Well, I certainly think they are touchable because I don't like a lot of their movies. They always seem to go from one big mega hit to a film that's, in my opinion, a bit disappointing. I was really looking forward to, what was the movie with the rat that was a chef? Ratatouille. And I was really disappointed by that. I just didn't enjoy it. And it's funny you mentioned about Toy Story 3, Matt, because that was a movie I really didn't like too much. Toy Story 3 was when I found their movies were starting to pull on the heartstrings a bit too obviously. Maybe I was just getting older and more cynical or whatever. I just didn't really enjoy that anymore. And I felt like I was sitting there and being manipulated by the films. And I felt that most in the film Inside Out recently, which I went to see that with my kids. And they, of course, loved it. And I read the reviews afterwards and they all raved about it. And that really took me by surprise because I found the film quite dull in places and also quite manipulative. So I certainly don't think that they're unchallengeable. The studio that I most like is DreamWorks. A lot of their films I've really preferred, and I think their films have definitely been made more with an eye towards an adult audience as well, you know, keeping the parents entertained while the movie's going on. I know Pixar do a lot of in-jokes in their films as well. So yeah, I would certainly say that DreamWorks is a fair challenger. They've got the Madagascar range of films, including the Penguins of Madagascar, of course. They did the Shrek movies as well, and a few other little movies like Over the Hedge, which I quite like. So there's certainly the capacity, I think, there for other studios to challenge Pixar, because let's face it, the technology is there for everyone to use nowadays, and I hope a lot more studios do in the future.
Okay, interesting points there. Thanks, Graham. Gordon?
Like Graham, I wouldn't say they're untouchable, and I do think DreamWorks run them close, but I think as much for the scripts that they produce, Pixar are definitely the masters. And whilst, like Graham, I didn't like Toy Story 3, and I did think it was overly sentimental and manipulative, I just think that the scripts and the direction of Pixar movies is on another level to the competition.
Matt?
I kind of agree with what both of them have said to a certain extent. They are undoubtedly the best, but they're not untouchable. Some of the recent films have been a bit pedestrian and not hit the heights of early ones. Notable examples there, Cars 2, Brave and The Good Dinosaur were all well below the standard of some of their other films. And in the meantime, Disney have come closest, I think, way more so than DreamWorks, to matching them with films like Wreck-It Ralph and especially Big Hero 6, which dealt with the more serious theme of grief and is to me a bit of a landmark film for Disney because they moved away from that saccharine, sweet, cute and cuddly theme that they've always had for Disney films and actually dealt with a subject that's a little bit more serious. Unfortunately, between those two great films, they did an awful old school Disney film which was Frozen, which is just an absolutely diabolical film that I hated with a passion. So other studios, I'm surprised to hear what people are saying about DreamWorks, because they've done some great films and some good animation, but for me the story really lets them down for the most part. I don't see much adult stuff in their films at all personally. It's very kid friendly. Shrek was good to start with but got tiresome, and things like Madagascar and Kung Fu Panda, it's just diminishing returns. It's just sequels that just get worse and worse.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I don't agree they're untouchable, but I also do agree with what Gordon said about the scripts and about the clout they have in the market. I think DreamWorks films are pretty good. I've watched quite a few. I watched all the Madagascars and I've watched other bits. I watched that new Disney Zootopia. It was all right. I didn't mind it. It seemed to be quite good. But I totally agree with you say about Big Hero 6. I think that's a brilliant film. And Wreck-It Ralph I think is excellent as well. But obviously the subject matter is something we particularly like. But yeah, I think Pixar obviously are on the top of their game. Even with the lesser films, I still think they're going to still make lots out of it. They're going to still get their merchandise. They're going to still be the leaders for the foreseeable future. I think DreamWorks have got a good back catalogue, but they need to start maybe just trying to look at something a little bit different, and maybe some other people just come out with something amazing and see if they can build on that.
I just watch Madagascar and Kung Fu Panda and think, why would I want to watch a sequel to that? And I haven't. They've got several sequels, whereas I would watch a sequel to most Pixar things, and some of them are better than others. But
it's funny you mentioned Big Hero 6 earlier, because I watched that and absolutely loved it, but then completely forgot about it. And that character surely could have been huge. And maybe it's just because I'm not a preteen child. I don't see Baymax everywhere. I don't know whether he was when the film was out, but I just thought that they could really have capitalised on that, and he could have been a huge character because he was brilliant. That character was genius.
Absolutely. It is interesting. I'm sure there'll be sequels to it. Did you know it's based on a Marvel comic?
No.
Baymax is very different in the comic. He's not a cute and cuddly character, but yeah, I didn't realise, that's Disney mixing Marvel property with their own animation studios, so that was quite interesting. I didn't find it as good the second time round, I must admit, but I still think it was a good film, and the themes that it was dealing with were quite cleverly done without being too over the top with the sentimentality that some of the other even Pixar films have done.
Well, just as a side note to that, are you like me, can you get bored of the typical American moralistic style of these films? Because the story, it just seems to be, you get introduced to the characters, then something bad happens, and then they are all in peril for a bit, and then they all suddenly work out ways to get through things. Then at the end, everything's great, and it's just a similar story all the way through in most of the films. And I suppose that's the whole point, is you don't want to end the film on a bad way.
But isn't that just the same as disaster movies like we talked about last time? They're all the same thing. I say that, but I do completely agree with you that I'm bored of the way of ramming this morals attitude down your throat, and it's often done in a way that is the all-American, if you're not with us, you're against us. It does get on my nerves that you're watching these films and that they're not just telling a story, they're trying to force home a message, and I wish they'd kind of move away from that. But then I step aside and say, well, actually most of these films are designed for kids, and these messages are great for kids, so maybe I should just stop watching them if they're going to wind me up.
Matt?
Pretty much the same. It'd be nice to see more animated films that explore serious emotional themes or maybe darker subject matter, but in the end they're big budget movies aimed at families, and it's not going to happen really, is it? And if it does, it's going to be dumbed down or still given a happy ending.
Yeah, that's pretty true. There's another point to that. Do you think sometimes they low budget on big names for voicing characters, and maybe they think, the voices will sell the film and not so much on the story?
Well, I don't think they blow the budget on big names, because the animation doesn't really suffer and the story's probably already written before any casting takes place. But I don't necessarily think a big name is required to sell the film. Having said that, Toy Story and Monsters Inc. in particular would be much lesser films, I think, were it not for the big name stars that have voiced the main characters in them. In particular, Billy Crystal as Mike in Monsters Inc. I thought was absolutely brilliant. Probably the best voice acting for the character that he portrays out of everything that Pixar and probably most of the other companies have done as well.
Yeah, he's very good. Gordon, what do you think?
Well, I'd kind of disagree with Matt. I do think that they blow huge parts of the budget on voice cast. I do think that there's a budget set out at the start that is diminished from the quality of the animation or the tuning of the story. So I think there are occasions where films are worse off because of the voice cast, because they've brought somebody in from the Big Bang Theory to do a voice, just the voice is well known. And these aren't great actors like Billy Crystal. These are TV quality, very, very average actors with a well-known voice. And yeah, I'm specifically talking about Sheldon Cooper now, but it's not just him. There's tons of them. And that does bother me. And often, if I hear that somebody like that is going to be leading one of these films, it just puts me off and I don't want to watch it.
It's funny you should mention the guy from The Big Bang Theory, because he was the voice actor of the character in Home, which I rated as my worst film of 2015. That film was terrible, and it was all because of him that it was terrible.
I watched that yesterday. I didn't think it was that bad.
It was absolutely shocking, that film was. It was like it was made for people with no attention span.
There you go. Kids would love it.
I'm sure kids did, because all it was bright colours and dreadful pop music. But yeah, for everyone else, it was shite.
Graham, have you got any thoughts on this point?
The quality that they bring in, as Gordon says, is not always great. I think there's a tendency of a lot of actors, because all they're doing is portraying the voice and they don't have their usual licence to act physically. I think a lot of people tend to overact in these roles. Sometimes I don't recognise the person that's doing the voice, and that's something that really annoys me as I watch a film, because there'll be a character and I won't recognise the voice and it will bug me throughout the entire movie. So I'd rather that these films were just voice acted by normal talented voice actors, of which there are plenty of people that specialise in that field, but obviously aren't famous in general. And I think there is actually a trend to combat this a little bit. It must be something that the studios have got feedback on, because in a lot of these movies where there's a human character, and sometimes even not a human character, there's definitely an effort to try and make the character look a little bit like the actor that's playing them. And I think that just takes you out of the movie even further. I mean, there's no real reason to it, in my opinion. So as far as I'm concerned, I'd be much happier if they didn't bother getting these big names in at all and just concentrated on making the movies funny and enjoyable. Having said that, some actors make very good voice actors as well, and they do a great role, but unfortunately that doesn't always make the films any better, in my opinion.
Thanks, Graham. I sometimes quite like the fact that there's a well-known voice behind one of the characters in the film, and it's just nice to hear them and you recognise it, and it's good. But then you also do, as you say, you get some of these guys who aren't well-known, and they do a really good job, and it's probably put a bit more into it. But sometimes it's nice to hear someone that you know and who are excited about doing the role and also want to take it seriously. Anyway, sort of wrapping this up, moving from hand-drawn animated films to CGI, what do you think it brought to the big screen that 2D animation couldn't put across or couldn't portray? Graham?
Obviously the type of movies are very different, but I think that's only because of the generational thing, really. I think the movies that were hand-drawn tended to be slower affairs, and nowadays it's a different type of movie, but not necessarily because of the animation. What the technology brings is a clearer visual and the ability to have a 3D effect as well, because obviously the 2D drawn animation is quite flat. But in terms of actual script, there's nothing really that 2D films couldn't do just as well.
We're all video game fans in the MovieMuse team, so when fully CGI films arrived, it was like all our birthdays came at once, surely, because we basically got to go inside a video game. I think the leap to 3D action in movies is just as big a step forward as the move to 3D in games was. It's a generational leap of that nature. But I think what's also paralleled with games and animated movies is that as soon as we made that leap, we dumbed everything down. And what we see in the video game world is that most of the innovation is in indie 2D games these days. You very rarely see a big budget 3D video game that's actually something new. And I think that's the same in animation. What we get more often are just these big budget, overblown spectacles with no substance and no innovation. So I think it was a massive generational leap backwards.
Interesting. Matt, what's your take on this?
Well, I think CGI allow films to have a bigger scale and create living, breathing worlds for the characters to occupy rather than the sort of static, hand-drawn backgrounds of 2D animation. If you look at something like Bug's Life, for example, the character animation is a bit ropey now by today's standards, but the natural world that the characters live in is still pretty gorgeous and full of life. I think it also allowed writers and directors to express creativity and come up with stories that simply couldn't be told using traditional animation. That doesn't necessarily mean the stories are always good. As Gordon has said, a lot of the stories are kind of identikit and don't really come up with anything creative. There's the potential for creativity, but that doesn't mean it's always lived up to. The other thing that's significant is they brought about a technology that allows animated films to be made more quickly and has fed back into the world of live action movies for motion capture and special effects and things like that. So it's not just what they brought to the cartoon medium themselves, but also what they brought to movie making in general that's fairly important.
Okay, what we're going to do is, guys, what is your favourite CGI animated film? Gordon, what do you like?
I was tempted to pick one of the traditional kid-friendly offerings like Cars or Bolt. I really like both of those. But I'm not going to pick them. I'm going to go for Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, because the animation in that is just simply stunning. You can tell it's animated, but it also looks real. It's just a stunning world that it takes you to, and the story was pretty decent too.
Graham, what's your favourite?
I was, like Gordon, tempted to go with child-friendly fare, and I suppose I did in the end, but I was thinking about maybe Shrek or even Despicable Me. But I actually went with a film called Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, which is from Sony Pictures, who, if you look at their list of animated films that they've produced, it's ropey at the very best, but this is one that shines out really. It's based on a book from 1978, a children's book of the same name, which probably helps, and unlike a lot of the films, it doesn't really have any cute animal characters in it. It's based on humans, and if you watch it, it's quite different from a lot of other animated movies. It's about an island off the coast of America and this inventor, and how he tries to invent a machine that rains food, and the fallout that happens because of this. And it's just a really good, quirky in places, funny and different animated movie, I think.
Matt?
Well, without wanting to come across as only liking animated films with robots in, for me it's WALL-E, a beautiful, joyful and brave film with one of the most adorable main characters in movie history. But I'd also like to give an honourable mention for Toy Story 3 and Up, two films that masterfully wring tears out of grown adults.
And I think they are three of the worst ones that I've seen.
Oh, I love WALL-E. You can't not like
No,
WALL-E.
I thought WALL-E was boring.
You need to watch
Sinclair,
it.
you have no soul.
I wasn't over impressed with that myself, to be honest. I didn't find the story particularly engaging.
The first 10 minutes is brilliant, and then it just becomes a more traditional
Oh,
animated
the dogs
adventure
are ace,
film.
though.
The dogs are good, yeah.
Right, well, I'm going to pick my film that is purely sentimental for me, really, because my son Alex absolutely loved this film, and it was just brought a lot of joy to us at the time. We had the games for it and everything like that, and I'm going to choose Pixar's 2006 film Cars. Owen Wilson, his voice acting is brilliant as Lightning McQueen. I just love all of them, even Paul Newman on one of his last film appearances. It was just, I like the whole story. It is the kind of thing where it all goes bad and then it becomes all good at the end, but that's part and parcel of these films, so you just got to get used to that. It's just a nice film, and I like the whole thing about them all their life and all the way they can have even like motels made of traffic cones and stuff. It was just, I love the whole concept of it.
I really liked Cars because if you took everybody out of the car and had them as a real actor in a non-animated movie, it'd still be a good movie. The fact that these were talking cars made it a nice visual thing, but I think it's a decent family film, even if you don't think of them as talking cars.
It's Doc Hollywood, isn't it? With Michael J. Fox in. It's basically Doc Hollywood, but with cars.
That's the choices. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We are now looking into the world of the animation hybrid, which is live action mixed with CGI or drawn animation. It's not a genre that's been explored too much over the years as major feature films. So obviously the one that stood out is the 1988 release of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was a Disney film with cartoon characters in it from Warner Brothers, etc. It was directed by Robert Zemeckis. It stars Bob Hoskins, Christopher Lloyd, Charles Fleischer and Stubby Kaye. It was set in Hollywood during the 1940s and in an alternative timeline when animated characters really do exist. The film is the story of Eddie Valiant, a private detective who must exonerate Roger Rabbit, who is accused of murdering a wealthy businessman. So, gentlemen, this is obviously one that if you ever say to anyone what live-action hybrid movie you can remember, I think most people will say, oh, Roger Rabbit. Do you think that was a strong movie to come out with? Was it risky to bring a film like that at the time? Because it's quite hard for actors to act with nothing in front of them. Do you think it worked as a movie? Also, do you think it sets a standard for the genre? Graham, I'll start with you.
I didn't see it at the time. I saw it about 5 or 6 years ago. I remember I watched it with my oldest son. I don't know. I find the whole genre a bit bemusing, really. When you talk about the first film that comes to mind, this sort of genre, the first film I think of is not really Roger Rabbit, but it's more films like Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which had animated sequences in them, although it was nowhere near as prevalent as in Roger Rabbit. With Roger Rabbit, I think as a film, it just about hangs together, but it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. My son kind of enjoyed it, but I think he was probably a bit too young to watch it at the time. If you watch it now, I suspect probably a lot of it looks quite ropey, but I've always thought this trend has been a bit of a gimmick, and I think probably Roger Rabbit is a good example of it, but I would still regard it as that, a gimmick film.
Matt, what are your thoughts?
I remember the hype about it and seeing all the making ofs, how they did various things like when the cartoon characters are squirting real water out of their mouths and all that kind of stuff. And I remember going to see it just after it came out while I was on holiday in Florida. But in retrospect, while it was an amazing technical achievement and impressive that they got the different animation studios to allow the use of their characters in the film, it's really a terrible, annoying and hard to watch film. There's not a lot of story to it. Once you take the effects out of the equation, it's just irritating really. Roger Rabbit in particular is spectacularly irritating. I'm not a fan in retrospect, although I enjoyed it at the time.
I'm going to disagree with both of you. I agree it's overlong, it's very dark in places, but I think it was technically a brilliant achievement, and I think it was a really fun film. And Roger Rabbit is an absolutely brilliant character. I didn't find him annoying at all. I thought he was really cute. I think that looking back, there's lots of things wrong with the film, particularly about how long it is, because it drags out for far too much of the film. But I thought it was a great achievement.
I haven't seen it recently, but like you said, G, I actually quite enjoyed it. It is too long. They could have cut quite a bit of that out. As much as Bob Hoskins doing a really good job of trying to act with nothing in front of him, sometimes it just doesn't work. You can see that he's either over-grabbing something that should be a cartoon character. He's not quite lined up as it should do, and it's a bit rough around the edges. But I think, as you say, a technical achievement, it was amazing for its time. But I do actually find it quite fun. I do like it for what it is, and it is sort of one that stands out.
Didn't it drive Bob Hoskins mad, supposedly? Maybe that's why he ended up doing Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah, more than likely. It must have been hard to act with nothing there all the time. I think he does a pretty good job of it, to be honest. Moving on from that, though, do you think this genre, because of the way it must be quite hard to do you think this is why a lot of these kind of hybrid films have been largely overlooked since then? I know Space Jam was obviously the big one as well. Why do you think that some just didn't really kick off from that, Gordon?
Well, I really enjoy live-action animated movies, and I just don't know why there aren't more. There are some pretty ropey ones, but I love seeing cartoon characters in real life, and I would love them to suddenly take off again and somebody to do another Space Jam. I do believe that a sequel to Space Jam is in the works, so hopefully this is it. But I'm hoping that something will kickstart it as a proper genre that's going to get bigger numbers of films being made in that style, because I definitely think it's been unfairly overlooked. But my concern is that what they'll do instead is we'll get films like The Jungle Book, the new Jungle Book I'm talking about, which is absolutely brilliant, but it's a human and the rest of the film is all CG animated. So there's nothing else in it that isn't animated apart from this one human boy. And I think we'll get more of that instead. I don't think we'll get many of the proper films that are live action with some 2D or 3D animated characters or whatever. What I would like to see more of are the films that mix the two together.
Graham, what's your thoughts?
I think the technology with the CGI has caught up so much these days that, like Gordon says, films blend the two together. That's probably why this genre, maybe it's still prevalent, but just not as noticeable these days. I think a lot of audience are probably polarised. If they want to go and see a cartoon, they'll go and see a cartoon. If they want to go and see a normal film, they'll go and see that. And maybe studios think there's too much risk in producing something that is a mix of the two. I don't know how these films are doing, but they've just never really appealed to me. And my kids don't seem particularly bothered about them. They'd rather just watch a cartoon film rather than something like that. So, I don't know, it just seems to me to be a genre that's got potential, but just isn't really going anywhere.
Matt, what's your take on this?
Well, I think in the traditional 2D animation era, it was probably overlooked because it was just too much work. There's so much work involved. It probably wasn't worth it in terms of what it would actually add to the film. Bedknobs and Broomsticks and Pete's Dragon, which no one's mentioned, did it pretty well, and that's just had a remake. And Roger Rabbit did it well, but there's not really any great films that have come out of this style. There's good moments in those films, but I don't think any of the films are brilliant. Since we've been in the CGI era, I don't think it is overlooked, actually. When you look back at the films that have got pure CGI characters in them, not motion captured, but actually pure cartoon characters in a real world. You've got Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, Casper, have all been films that have been reasonably successful and got CGI characters interacting with real world characters. And obviously the Jungle Book, as Gordon mentioned, is pretty much a cartoon with one real life character in it rather than the other way around. So I don't think it is overlooked anymore. I think it's just slightly evolved from being two disparate entities thrown together to being all part and parcel of one film.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt. A culmination of that is, anyone got a particular favourite hybrid movie? Graham, have you anything that you like out of that genre?
Well, it is mainly live action with a little bit of animation in it, so I'm not sure if it really counts, but one of my favourite kids' movies is Mary Poppins, and that's got some animated sequences in it, so I'll pick that one. I'm not too keen on most of the others, to be honest.
Matt?
I wouldn't really call it a favourite, but I'm going to go with a film that me and my sister used to watch when we were kids. It's Dot and the Kangaroo, which is a late 70s Australian film based on the novel of the same name, and it featured real-life Australian bush locations overlaid with animated characters. I watched it again recently. Not an amazing film, but it has got some good moments, and the hybrid between real locations and animated characters is quite good for its time.
Gordon?
I almost went with Bedknobs and Broomsticks, just because of the brilliant jungle soccer match. I'm not a fan of the rest of the film, but I thought that scene was absolutely brilliant. But I've gone for my favourite film to watch when I'm not well, and it's Space Jam. Michael Jordan and the Looney Tunes in an interdimensional basketball game for freedom. It's funny, it's really well put together, and it's my go-to film for sick days, sat on the couch with a duvet and a lemsip.
Aww, makes you feel all warm and fuzzy.
It does.
I'm going to be boring and go for Roger Rabbit. It is rough around the edges, but I still think it's quite fun. And to be honest, it's got Jessica Rabbit in it, so I don't really care what the rest of the film's like.
You should pick Cool World on that basis then, because that's got Kim Basinger and she actually shags someone in that. Look on YouTube, it's weird. It's Gabriel Byrne having sex with a cartoon Kim Basinger.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Check that out.
Thanks a lot, guys. We're now going to look at the other animated movie techniques. In this category, you've got things like stop motion, claymation, which is things like the Aardman films, and things like anime and manga. We've gone through hand-drawn, we've gone through CGI. And what do you think about the market for non-standard animation types? So personally, I think it's still going to be there. It's going to be different. It works, I think, on a different level. It just brings something different to the eye. It's just, I think, it's an antidote to the CGI saturation. Things like Aardman, they came out of nowhere. I really love the Wallace and Gromit films. I think obviously the first one looks rough as ready these days, but I think as they went on, they got refined, and I really enjoyed them. But what do you think? Can it go hand in hand with CGI? Can you have different styles still as feature films, or are you talking about TV films, or are they just like your hour-long Christmas specials? Matt, what do you think?
I think there's definitely still a market for it, but I think much like 2D animation now, it's probably a niche thing, probably the domain of independent filmmakers for the most part. Although there have been a few recent examples of stop motion. Even Aardman went back to do more stop motion, I think, after they did Flushed Away. I think the Pirates one and Shaun the Sheep, I think they're both stop motion again, aren't they? And they came out since. The sheer time it takes to make a stop motion film means they're probably impractical for most production companies. I would like to see more Aardman stuff, but they're probably better as short films rather than feature length.
Graham, what's your take on this?
I think these claymation films, they certainly have a lot of charm, and they're very whimsical, a lot of them. It's kind of a British institution, isn't it, really, especially Wallace and Gromit. But I think it's like the point I made about 2D animation earlier. I just don't think kids these days, I mean, my kids aren't particularly interested by Wallace and Gromit. They would rather watch a cartoon any day. Although the exception, I know it's not claymation, but it's in a similar style, is Flushed Away, which I really enjoyed as well. I think it's a really good film. To be honest, I think all these animation techniques are probably always going to be second best to CGI these days. Not a good thing necessarily, but due to market forces, and that's what everyone seems to want, unfortunately.
What do you make of it, Gordon?
I think that non-standard animation is both the saviour and the downfall. I think creativity is the saviour. Animators and directors are expressing themselves in amazing ways, and you can look at films like Anomalisa, which was probably my favourite film of the last 12 months. It was brilliant, it was acclaimed critically, but commercially it was doomed to fail. Just like all of these non-standard animations, there's never going to be a big hit in commercial terms. In terms of claymation specifically, I think it's great, but like Matt said earlier, I struggle to maintain interest for a full 90 minutes. Shaun the Sheep was a good example of that. It's a very funny film, and to say it's a film with no actual English in it, so it's like watching a foreign language film with no subtitles. But it's very funny, but I still waned around the hour mark. I've had enough of this now. So if they stuck to half an hour, 45-minute shorts, I'd be much happier, because it is really a clever and engaging medium.
Good point. I think that as a feature film at 90 minutes, I think it's just quite a lot to expect. Okay, moving on from that, another kind of medium that seems to be very popular, especially in Japan, is anime and manga. It's not a style of cartoon that I've ever really got into and watched. It's obviously very popular here and in Japan and America. Is it something that you guys have watched? Do you know anything about it? Matt, what do you think of anime and manga?
The only one I've seen that falls into this category, I think, is My Neighbor Totoro, which was good. I enjoyed it. It was funny and quirky, but I don't really have any experience to say anything more about it. To be honest, anime is not really something I've got much interest in. Manga is comics, isn't it?
I think, strictly speaking, it's a comic in Japan, but in the Western world we see it as a style of anime. And for me, and it's obviously not the true definition, I associate it with ultra-violent stuff for angry young teens. But anime is more grown-up animated feature films. They usually tell us serious stories through some fantastical setting. And I'm a huge fan of the Japanese anime stuff. And I mentioned earlier Studio Ghibli, they're the cream of the crop, and films like Grave of the Fireflies, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, these are absolutely stunning films. And I know most people, if you said to them, do you like anime, they'd say no. But there are some films that I think most people would actually love if they had the inclination to sit down and watch them. And I think from what I know about all of our film tastes, all of us would love Princess Mononoke. So that may be a film club choice in the future. But there are other examples that aren't from Ghibli as well. Films like Tekonkenreet, I think that's how you say it, Paprika, Tokyo Godfathers, absolutely stunning films that will mean nothing to you unless you go and Google them. Particularly Tokyo Godfathers, which is about 3 tramps who find a baby and bring up this baby living rough on the streets in Japan on Christmas Eve. Fantastic film. So I'm a big fan of anime.
That last one sounded like 3 men and a baby crossed with tramps.
It's a bit of a loose connection, but yeah.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Coming out of all of this, have any of you got a favourite non-standard animated film? I'll start with you, Graham.
The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which I thought was a really clever and smart claymation film.
Gordon.
Well, I've already mentioned mine in my comments before. Anomalisa is definitely the best animated film I've seen in a long time. It's stop motion style and it's written and directed by Charlie Kaufman, who is my favourite screenwriter as well. So everything was great in that film.
Matt.
I haven't seen too many films of this subgenre, but I'd probably pick Frankenweenie, which is the Tim Burton stop motion film about a young Victor Frankenstein who resurrects his dead dog. It's made in black and white in a vintage horror style, quite visually striking and quite a touching story as well, which also parodies classic monster movies and characters that are really quite ugly and yet endearing. So yeah, I quite enjoyed that one.
One that really stands out for me, that I've watched over many times, is Wallace and Gromit in The Wrong Trousers. I just love the fact that Feather McGraw, the penguin, is just so evil, and the fact that you can put a glove on his head and become a chicken is fantastic. And I just love that kind of stuff, and the film's always stood out for me.
That is the best one, undoubtedly.
I'm surprised none of us have mentioned The Nightmare Before Christmas, and I didn't think of it until you mentioned Tim Burton and Frankenweenie.
It's alright, but I'm not a fan of any stuff with music in, like singing. I've mentioned my hatred for early Disney stuff. That's one of the reasons for it, and I don't like The Nightmare Before Christmas because it's got singing in. It's great animation, but I'm not a fan of singing in films generally.
The final thing is, what does the future hold for animation films? Do you think we're going to carry on with CGI? Are we going to still have kids' films as the same format as they are? Will something different happen? Will some other studio come to the fore? Will 2D make a comeback? Gordon, what do you think?
I think the genre will go on and on. The landscape's going to be dominated by CGI, that goes without saying. But there'll be some who'll try to keep true to the art form. Though I think even those will, in most cases, go for a faux 2D CGI style rather than pen and ink. And one example of that is Raymond Briggs, the guy who's famous for his Snowman books. His latest film, Ethel and Ernest, which comes out in October, is actually based on a book that he wrote about the life and death of his parents. And it's got this odd style that looks like it's hand-drawn in stills. But as soon as you see a video of the trailer, it's clear that it isn't and that it's definitely computer-generated. And I think we'll see much more of this because it's cheaper to produce. But I don't think it's a good thing for the art form. So I think animated movies will go on and on, but not necessarily for good.
Graham, what do you think?
About the same, really. It would be nice to think that there's going to be more innovation. I would like to see more cartoons aimed not at pre-teens. I'm talking mainstream, obviously, because I know they do exist outside the mainstream. But in the mainstream, more animations aimed at teenagers. I think films like Sausage Party look quite fun as well, so there's potential there for more films like that. But whether it will be realised in this hard commercial world is another matter.
Matt, what's your take?
Much the same, really. I'm sure there'll be plenty of throwaway, family-friendly CGI films voiced by American comedy stars. Hopefully we'll get a bit more genius from Pixar and some more of the recent good stuff from Disney, though sadly I suspect there'll undoubtedly be Frozen 2 in there as well. I'd like to see Pixar make an animated film that's aimed purely at adults, not an R-rated film like Sausage Party, but something that's got a serious theme but doesn't pander to children, and an animated Star Wars film set in the original trilogy timeline would be great.
Thanks, Matt. I like the sound of that, actually. I like the point, a full CGI film that isn't for kids. It's totally an adult film or a serious film that's in CGI. I don't know whether we'll see anything like that too soon, but it would be a different take on the CGI film.
Well, unfortunately, Sausage Party isn't that film, because that film is a kids' film with loads of swearing. There's nothing in the film for adults other than toilet humour, which can be funny, but unfortunately for me, it wasn't in this film.
Did you see, by the way, Gordon, it rather controversially got 4 stars on the Guardian website?
Yeah, I did, and
The reviewer was getting so much shit in the below-the-line comments.
I didn't look at any of the comments, but I'm glad that they're getting stick for it. I thought it was dreadful.
Because
But
apparently the same reviewer gave Big Hero 6 3 out of 5. So basically he's saying Sausage Party is much better than Big Hero 6.
yeah.
All right, well, thanks very much, gentlemen. That wraps up our main feature this evening, the animated movie. Moving swiftly on, Film Club. This month, Film Club was chosen by my good self, and I chose the 1996 American crime comedy Bottle Rocket. This film was directed by Wes Anderson, but also co-written by him with Owen Wilson. And also, in addition to being Wes Anderson's directional debut, Bottle Rocket was a debut feature for the brothers Owen and Luke Wilson, but also starred James Caan and Robert Musgrave. Upon his release from a mental hospital following a nervous breakdown, the directionless Anthony joins his friend Dignan, who seems far less sane than the former. Dignan has hatched a harebrained scheme for a yet unspecified crime spree that somehow involves his former boss, the supposedly legendary Mr. Henry. To help with their pathetic neighbour and pal Bob, Anthony and Dignan pull a job and hit the road, where Anthony finds love with the motel maid Inez. When our boys finally hook up with Mr. Henry, the ensuing escapade turns out to be far from what anyone expected. Well, I saw it years ago, and I just came back to me when we were thinking about Film Club, and it all stuck with me. I found it quite a fun film, quite a bit on the road, and like the way that they got ripped off themselves at the end, and it was quite an interesting movie. Anyway, so yeah, that was my Film Club choice this month. Graham, what did you think of Bottle Rocket?
I was quite in two minds about this. I ended up not really liking the movie, but not for the reasons I thought, actually. I really don't like Owen Wilson. I don't know why. His accent and his style of acting just really annoys me. I've just never enjoyed any film he's been in. So I kind of wasn't looking forward to it because he's in it. I don't mind Luke Wilson too much. And actually I didn't mind him too much in it. I thought he was okay. He played a slightly crazy character with a rather stupid name. But what I didn't like about the film, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Wes Anderson, and I don't really understand what all the fuss is about his films, to be honest. This film had a nice setup. I thought it was quite nice the way it was set up, and I was quite intrigued to start off with. The opening scene at the funny farm was quite good, and the way he kind of escaped, so to speak. But it just, first of all, the characterisation is pretty strange in it. You never really quite get to the bottom of the characters in it, and nothing really happens in it. And as I say, the first 20 minutes are quite good, but the scenes in the motel are just really tedious, and the film doesn't really go anywhere fast, and I didn't really find it particularly engaging, and the crime element of it was a bit bizarre. I didn't really understand why they were doing it or why they felt that way. They just had this plan and they were going to follow it through, and I just didn't really get any of it. I don't know if I missed something, and by the time James Caan turned up, I was pretty disinterested by them, but he obviously is a good actor and he livens it up a lot. But the twist at the end is, I thought, fairly obvious. It was fairly obvious that these losers were going to get ripped off by a real criminal. And then there's the irony, of course, at the end with the way the characters' situations are turned around. It's okay, I suppose. It's not a terrible film by any standard, but it's certainly not something I'd watch again. I must admit I didn't really enjoy it, I'm afraid, Simon, and I would give it 2 out of 5.
Thanks, Graham. Matt?
To be honest, I found it really boring for the most part. There seemed to be lots of potentially interesting things happening, but it was still really dull. I just didn't connect with any of the characters in it at all. There were some funny moments, but there was just way too much talk and not enough action, which I think is a hallmark of these Wes Anderson films. By the time it got to the final heist, I'd lost interest, and that wasn't even that exciting either. Luke Wilson I thought was pretty good in it, but couldn't take Owen Wilson seriously because his haircut was just ridiculous. I don't think he's had any haircut other than his floppy blonde hair in any other film I've seen him in, and he shouldn't ever have any haircut other than that floppy blonde hair. I also thought it was a bit ridiculous not to cast them as brothers in the film, since they look and sound almost identical. I've not seen much of Wes Anderson's stuff. Royal Tenenbaums I think is the only other one, and based on this I won't bother, so it's 2 stars from me as well.
Gordon?
Well, I'm not a particular fan of Wes Anderson's films either, and find most of his films to be pretentious claptrap. The exception to this are the excellent Grand Budapest Hotel and the Darjeeling Limited, so I would recommend anybody watches them if they haven't. But Bottle Rocket fits somewhere between those and claptrap. It's the Owen Wilson show, and it winds me up. He gets more than a bit annoying as Dignan. And while I did like the characters, I also liked how the craziest one is the mastermind and the sanest one is the one that's been in a mental institution, which is probably a good parallel for real life, looking at who's running the country. I was disappointed with the big job at the end, as you guys have said, and I was really expecting something of a bigger farce, and particularly because I do know more of Wes Anderson's stuff than you guys, it seems, I was expecting more from that, and it didn't deliver. But it was still a fun film, and I'm going to give it 3 stars.
Well, I chose it, but I haven't seen it for a long time, and, I still find it quite a fun film. I must admit, I agree with you slightly when it does drag on a bit when they're at the motel, but I'll give it 3.5 stars out of 5. Thanks very much, chaps. You give us an average score of 2.6, and it puts it 7th on the leaderboard out of 8. Oh well, never mind. Next month's Film Club choice is Graham. So Graham, what excitement have we got to look forward to?
I think I've chosen a film here that has potential to be even worse, and maybe even better, who knows, because actually it's a film that I've not seen either. A few months ago when I first started getting into vinyl again, I went to my local second-hand record shop, and as usual I kept an eye out for soundtracks. But actually, I saw the soundtrack to this film, and because of the title of the film, I didn't think it was a soundtrack to start off with. I thought it was some sort of 80s compilation, because the name of the film is Party Party. And that obviously sounds like some sort of party compilation, but as I examined it further, I realised that it was a film soundtrack, had some pretty decent tracks on it, and it was only £2, so I bought it. And then when I got home, I had a look at the film on IMDb, saw it starred Carolyn Quintin, who I've always had a bit of a soft spot for, so I thought, why not? I'll buy this DVD. And I thought, well, why not make it the subject of Film Club, a film that actually none of us have seen. It stars Daniel Peacock and is directed by Terry Windsor. I've never heard of Terry Windsor, but Daniel Peacock was most known, certainly by me, for starring in the comic strip Adventures. And it stars other luminaries of the TV scene, such as Carl Howman, who was in, of course, Brush Strokes, and Perry Fenwick, who played Billy in EastEnders. So there's a real heavyweight cast behind this film. Don't know a lot about it. It's about this guy who decides to obviously throw a party and the shenanigans that happen as a result of it. And yeah, we'll see on the next episode what everyone thinks of Party Party from 1983.
Hello, darling. What would you say if I asked you out tonight? Eh?
20th Century Fox invite you to the social event of the year.
Here, girls, you fancy a party tonight?
If I don't get a bloke tonight, I'll kill myself. You should be wearing a low-cut dress. I don't want the blokes to think I'm easy. You are easy.
What are you laughing at? I'm going to pull tonight. Well, don't I always, mate? No. Linda. Toby. Julie. No. You're a good-looking girl.
We're both good lookers.
You want to bet? You dangle it above her head. As it dangles, you kiss her. Hard. I'm sorry, Bobby. No.
Yes.
Of course we're skinheads. Do you want to film on it?
Do you mind?
No.
Nor do I. I don't want you getting the wrong idea.
Say that.
Wait.
You want trouble before you got it.
Party Party. One thing's for sure, the neighbours ain't gonna like it. Party Party.
Terrific.
Thank you very much, Graham. That should be an interesting one, yeah. A bit of a TV cast. I know Daniel Peacock because he was in The Young Ones and he was in all of sorts. He was in Metal Mickey and Only Fools and Horses as well. Right, our next segment is the classic scene, where one of the MovieMuse team choose a classic and or iconic scene from a movie and we're going to watch. This month's choice is from Gordon.
I've chosen a scene from Oliver Stone's 1986 war drama Platoon. It's the scene where Elias, after being betrayed and shot by Tom Berenger's character, Staff Sergeant Barnes, is gunned down by Vietnamese soldiers just before the rescue helicopter can reach him. It was a really emotional scene, and I've mentioned on a previous podcast that it's the first movie scene that ever made me cry, probably in big part due to the excellent use of Barber's Adagio for strings throughout the scene.
Hold your orbit. Guns, pull off. We're trying to come around my side.
Moving on to the next segment, which is three of the best. This month we are all going to choose our top 3 animated TV shows. So obviously there's quite a lot of choice there. Graham, what is your top 3?
My top 3 are in reverse order. Tom and Jerry, the anarchic cartoon, purely because it's just simply crazy and it's just about 2 characters trying to beat the shit out of each other, and there's no messages or anything like that behind it. They're all quite short, obviously 5 minutes, and they're just huge fun, and I think they're also transgenerational as well. I think they can be enjoyed by anyone of any age. My second favourite is Dungeons and Dragons, which I have watched recently and is pretty terrible actually watching it now, but I remember having a lot of fun watching this back in the day. I was quite keen on my Dungeons and Dragons, and although it's a very basic adaptation, I always thought it was quite a cool cartoon. And my favourite of all time is Battle of the Planets. I was really keen on sci-fi when I was younger, and still am now, and I always thought this was a great sci-fi cartoon, obviously with a slightly Japanese bent to it as well. And I always had the hots for the female character in it as well, so that was always good to watch. So they're my 3.
Thanks very much, Graham. Interesting choices. Gordon?
In third place, I've gone for Duckman, Private Dick, Family Man. It's a show about an insane, alcoholic, sex-starved, murderous detective duck and his pig sidekick. It was developed by Caspi Klusko, the producers who also brought us The Simpsons, and it was the perfect post-pub viewing and has a great voice performance from Jason Alexander, who is George in Seinfeld, as the foul-mouthed anti-hero. In second place, I've gone for Thundercats. Running from 1985 to 1989, Thundercats for me won the battle against He-Man by bringing a team of super cool battle cats rather than just a single hero. The coolest cats on TV, and the first time for me that a cartoon character was ever seriously sexy, and I'm talking about Cheetara and not Lion-O before you say anything, and it had a seriously scary bad guy in Mum-Ra. A new series was produced in 2011, and a movie has been long rumoured but doesn't seem any closer to becoming a reality. Shame really, as I'd really love to see Samuel L. Jackson kicking fur as Panthro.
Surely Vin Diesel would be Panthro.
No, he'd be...
He was the blue one, wasn't he?
Yeah.
The blue one with the bald head?
Yeah.
That's Vin Diesel.
No. In first place, I've gone with Rhubarb and Custard. Great sarcastic humour, one of the best cartoon art styles, probably the best ever theme music, and the real Angry Birds make it the best British kids cartoon ever.
I'm going to have that tune in my head now.
Your turn, Matt.
Okay, in third place, I've gone for, much like the other 2 guys, an 80s classic, Transformers. What's not to like about a TV show featuring cars and planes that turn into giant robots? It was also better than He-Man or Thundercats because it had an ongoing story rather than standalone individual episodes. Second place, I've gone for Star Wars Rebels, which is a recently released show on Disney XD. The first Star Wars production to be made after Disney bought Lucasfilm, and the first evidence that the franchise was in safe hands. It's a typical Star Wars adventure story featuring previously unseen heroes at the start of the Rebel Alliance, plus guest appearances from familiar characters such as the droids Lando Calrissian and Darth Vader, voiced by their original actors, I might add. It's a made-for-kids cartoon channel, so it can be a bit childish at times, but the second season takes on a darker tone. I've just started watching the first few episodes of that, and it's something no Star Wars fan should miss. And in first place, I've gone for, much like Graham's choice of Tom and Jerry, I've gone for Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons. Always loved them as a kid and still enjoy them now. The hapless coyote's pursuit of the Roadrunner and his never say die attitude really appeals to me, and the devices he comes up with are often ingenious, and they're always disastrous failures are still funny after all these years.
Thank you, Matthew. I've gone for three this is just from me when I was a kid. These are the ones that just stuck out in my mind. I could have picked hundreds of them. It's such a hard thing to pick, but in third place is The Jetsons, which is a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, which is sort of the futuristic space age counterpart to the Flintstones. I just love what they thought the future was going to be like. I even did the noise of the spaceship, which is in my head at the moment, when they used to fly around. I quite like the idea of it. It was good humour. It was just so different to the time. I do like the Flintstones, but I just prefer the Jetsons myself. My number two is a spin-off from Wacky Races, which is Darcy and Muttley and their flying machines, or Stop the Pigeon as it's mostly known, but it actually wasn't its name. I don't know what it is about the characters in it. I just love Clunk, and I love the whole thing when they just keep trying to invent ways in different planes to try and stop this pigeon, and it just never ever works. It's just, and I like Wacky Races, so it's just a good follow on from that. But my favourite, which is quite different, it's not a cartoon, is Thunderbirds, produced by Jerry and Sylvia Anderson in 1965. I've been a massive Thunderbirds fan ever since I saw it when I was a kid, and it was using a form of electronic marionette puppetry dubbed through marionation combined with scale models and special effects, and I just love Thunderbirds. It's the Tracy family trying to save people, and Thunderbirds has always been my favourite. I hope we can use that in an animation, because I suppose it is.
Oh, I don't know, that's a bit controversial, don't you think?
Animation, isn't it?
Well, not really, it's
not,
puppetry.
Oh, okay.
One thing I don't understand is, why were they trying to stop the pigeon?
I think the pigeon obviously had some dispatches that he was trying to get to somewhere
good
else.
Point. Yeah, maybe it was a carrier pigeon with.
Is it actually a World War II spy thriller then?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's all taken on a completely different light.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, gentlemen. We now come to our original soundtrack. This is where one of the MovieMuse team choose a track from an original soundtrack, one of the movies that has special meaning to us. So this month, Matthew is choosing the track. What have you got for us?
We've been doing these podcasts for around about 10 months now, and nobody's chosen a John Williams soundtrack yet, so I'm rectifying that situation on this episode. I'm choosing the soundtrack for Star Wars, The Force Awakens. In my review of the film on the website that I did back in December, I did say that I wasn't that impressed with the soundtrack, and to some extent that is still true. Just like the film, it taps into familiarity and does rely too heavily on themes from the original trilogy. However, it does introduce a few new themes which I think are all excellent. Firstly, Kylo Ren's theme, which you first hear in the opening scene when his shuttle arrives on Jakku. There's no denying when you hear that theme that an evil character is about to show up, and even though Kylo himself turned out to be a bit of a stroppy bitch, this theme is still great. And second was Rey's theme, which is quite playful and light-hearted, but still suggests the power that the character is ultimately discovered to have. But the best theme is the one that accompanies the closing sequence of the film, where Rey climbs the steps of the first Jedi Temple to discover Luke Skywalker, who's been in hiding. The theme cleverly builds up anticipation as she climbs the stairs, and really got me on the edge of my seat as she offers the lightsaber to Luke. And as you wait for him to say something, suddenly the scene and the film ends with a musical flourish that promises even bigger adventures to come. So my choice for this show is the Jedi Steps and finale from The Force Awakens, and we probably won't listen to the whole 8 minutes of the track that plays over the end credits of the movie, but it's the first couple of minutes that's the most important.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Coming towards the end of the podcast now, so that just brings my esteemed colleague Matthew to bring us the info for our next show.
Thank you, Simon. In our next show, we'll put on our most terrifying costumes and journey deep into the MovieMuse morgue to take a look at the world of horror movies. We'll talk about what makes a good horror movie, our earliest memories of being scared by film, take a look at some of cinema's most famous monsters, and of course answer the famous question, what's your favourite scary movie? So join us next month for the MovieMuse Halloween Horror Special, if you dare.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up the MovieMuse Animation Antics podcast. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did, and we look forward to seeing you all for our Halloween special. Don't forget to keep an eye on our website, moviemuse.net, and of course on YouTube and Facebook for the podcast and all information to do with our MovieMuse team. From all of us here at MovieMuse Towers, that's a very goodbye from me. That's all, folks.
That's my line. Step aside, babe. Let a star do this. That's all! That's all, folks!
Can I go home now?